let's break it down into a BRD, right? So we heard. So project scope statement is going to come after this, and then the scope baseline will come after we create the scope. Right? So everything that we create here is it's sort of like a chain. Create the scope, right? Collect the requirements, define the scope, break the work down. That's sort of what we're doing here. All right, and then just remember that for PMI, a requirement is a condition or a capability that must be present in the finished product to satisfy a business need. This is the reason why earlier we talked about like FDA or regulatory laws. Those aren't requirements; they're EEFs, because those things aren't necessarily required to create the product or to finish the project. They're just required to operate within that municipality or that AHJ. So that's the idea there. And PMI will be very explicit about that in their questions. We're going to get to another spot, and I'm going to mention it now. When we get to schedule, when we get to scheduling, and we start sequencing activities, and we start thinking about dependencies, you know, internal, external dependencies, and then we have soft dependencies and hard dependencies. The exam tries to make things like government regulations seem like it's a hard dependency because it's mandatory where you're operating, but it's not, right? They're external dependencies, right? So I just want to mention that there because there's some parallels. Mention that now. All right, so here's the tools and techniques we're gonna talk about when we collect requirements. There's a lot of them, and as you can see, we're taking outputs from the previous processes that we've already done. We're taking the charter, we're taking the project management plan, right? We're taking any contracts that exist, ES, OPAs, project documents we've created so far, and then the business case. We need to know the business case as well. Use different techniques of gathering data, right? We may interview folks, send out surveys, you know, questionnaires, do things like that. We may analyze the data. One second. We're going to have different ways of analyzing that information. We may use it to vote, you know, ranking and voting. I'd like you guys to write the word nominal next to voting because that's a term PMI will use. Nominal, N-O-M-I-N-A-L, just because my handwriting's not that good. Nominal, they'll use that term sometimes. So you know that it's really just ranking and scoring or voting and scoring. That's what that means. Okay. Then we have multi-criteria decision analysis. That's a fancy term from PMI. Multi-criteria, more than one. Decision, please pick something. And analysis. This is one of PMI's favorite words. You're going to see this word a lot, analysis. For PMI, this literally means double check. Measure twice, cut once type deal. Go back and make sure that what you have is correct. So multi-criteria, think of how we hire people. Multiple criteria. Okay, how many years of experience? You know, how much are you asking? Where did you come from? All this other stuff. And then we're going to interview you, and we're going to have different groups interview you. We've seen your resume. And now that you've met all this criteria and we've picked you, we're going to double check. We might run a background check. We might, you know, do a drug screen. We might do all of these things. We might, you know, sit down and huddle and say, okay, these are the candidates. This is the one we choose. Are we sure? All right, we're going to double check. That's the analysis. So when you see these words from PMI, break them down. Multi-criteria decision analysis. Big term, but it just means make sure what you're choosing is the right thing. All right, as we go through real quick. Yeah, we will. So I don't want to go too deep. Sorry. All right, we may show different documents. We're gonna use our skills. We have context diagrams and prototypes. So let's jump into all of these things. So requirements documentation defines and documents the requirements in the unambiguous terms necessary. Unambiguous, it's gotta be very clear, very specific to define the scope baseline. So 6 requirement categories are used to classify, and we have business requirements, stakeholder requirements, all used. So here in the Bay Area, Salesforce is building a huge tower, 60 stories, something like that. And next to Salesforce, there's these 3 very large high-end apartment buildings, you know, again, 50, 60 stories. Well, one of those buildings, is slightly leaning, and you can actually see it. It's a big deal. The engineering firm is taking a huge hit because, whatever they did, they didn't do it right. And so, the sinking, it's leaning a little bit. So Salesforce comes in to build their tower, and they use these 6 things. They talked about the business requirements of this project and the need to be in downtown San Francisco to attract the talent that's in the area. They talked about, okay, the stakeholder needs of not having construction begin before 8 or after 4, so that the people that lived in that area, that are working in that area, aren't going to be subject to noise after hours. They talked about, the solution requirements to make sure that they engineered and double checked in 2 or 3 times to make sure that their building was not going to lean like the last building that, the city and county of San Francisco approved to have come up. They talked about the transition or the readiness requirements of when that building does go into production, what's going to happen with all the traffic in the area and all the people, and how are we going to actually, incorporate this into the city. And so, there's a lot of public things that sort of happen before this project even goes in terms of town halls, et cetera. And then the product itself. They built something large enough that, they're actually going to own it. They're going to become a REIT, a real estate investment trust. And so in this sense, they own the building, and now they're going to lease it out to other companies, right? And so now there should be some sort of synergy between talent in the area, and then the quality of the building, the amenities for the employees, the amenities for the public, and, how it's going to help. So these are the types of, and I use that because PMI is going to give you examples like this, but they're not going to just come out and say, hey, this is a stakeholder requirement or business requirement. They're just going to describe it. They're going to describe it something similar to what I mentioned, and you're going to have to be able to deduce which it is. They typically won't make you say this is a solution or a product requirement. They'll just, you just need to know that it is a requirement. So what you mentioned earlier as the Mike, as your BRD, this is that document for PMI. They just don't call it the business requirements. They just call it requirements documentation because there may be business. There's more than just business requirements, right? There's the other 5, I should say. All right, here's the traceability matrix, and you mentioned that. So many times, if you have a requirements list, then you may just save that and make a new file because it's using an Excel spreadsheet, unless you have some software like JAMA or something like that that's using it for you. But, you'll then go back and add, okay, in your traceability matrix, it usually ties to trace a requirement back to the owner or some sort of acceptance or test criteria. We will trace it back to a business case. So on the exam, those are the 3 that are typically called out. Not an exhaustive list, but you'll get some question that says, which of the following documents will best assist the project manager to find out who they need sign off on from a particular, and they won't use the word requirement, but, device. They'll describe something and, and say device or, a test case or something like that. It's going to be the traceability matrix. So don't ignore this output. There's 2 of them. There's the requirements documentation itself. There's the traceability matrix, and the traceability matrix gets called out, pretty often on the exam as well.
Hey, CJ, on that traceability matrix, can you explain the difference between verification, how PMI defines verification versus validation?
Think verification is QC. We test and inspect. Yep, it meets its requirements. And in validation, okay, the customer says, yeah, I get it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll say it this way, because this is how I say it in the class, so that way you remember, is that we verify, customers validate, right? And it's kind of the idea of I'm getting a haircut, or I'm a lady, I'm getting my hair styled, and I'm as a person, I'm validating, I'm looking in the mirror and I'm validating that you gave me the right haircut or the right hairstyle, versus the barber or the hairstylist is looking at my hair and they're verifying that they cut my hair right or they styled my hair right. So those are the 2 differences. Okay. Key inputs, the plans that we just created and the stakeholder management plan. We haven't gotten to that process yet, but we would take that into account because we got to think about how we want to engage the stakeholders to elicit requirements from them. Can I do it in person? Do I have to do it, over the phone? Is it going to be via email? How will I do that? So we take this plan into account as well. All All right, we'll take the business documents that we have from the charter, business case, charter, high level. There goes that word again, high level. Tools and techniques. There's a lot of them here. So I'm going to go through these because you'll see these on the exam. So we got the data gathering. All right, this makes sense in terms of data gathering. It makes sense to most people, you know, about brainstorming and interviews and focus groups. All right, so I think we covered that one. And same thing with data analysis. Right, it's PMI's way of saying double check, measure twice, cut once, and the other cliche that you have. Check your documents. That might show you some additional requirements that you need. Okay, and then data representation. This is us now, whether it's on a whiteboard or maybe it's a Visio diagram or lucid charts or something like that. Maybe it's mind mapping, maybe a bunch of stickies. But this is us now taking that raw data that people have provided in this session that you're facilitating, and you're turning it into a picture for better understanding. Right, so affinity diagrams. Anybody not familiar with an affinity diagram? Okay, mind mapping. Oh, Maggie. Okay, so Maggie. So I'll start with mind mapping and go back to affinity diagrams. Mind mapping is the idea of, you know, let's say I have, you know, I have one big idea, and that turns into a couple ideas out here, and then each of those, you know, create a few ideas. Might have one there, and then this one spurns a few more, right? And so that's sort of your standard mind map. And then affinity diagramming will come around and it'll group these requirements together. And one of the best ways I can describe this is if you think software, because we all use some type of application, and there's different user types. So there's an admin, there's a read-only, there's a regular user, there's a super user. We're seeing this in the automobile industry too, where we start to group these requirements together and we say, okay, these kind of look like they go together, and oh, these match and these match. So affinity diagrams are used many ways. In the automobile industry, you're seeing it used where they know that there's a mom driver, dad driver, teenage driver, in-law driver. So, you know, when you sit in the seat, it senses the weight, and the steering wheel shifts and your station presets and the mirrors move, right? You're going to see that as a standard piece in most cars. It just takes 5 years because, you know, it's 5 years development cycle for a typical car. All right, so let me get those off. All right, so a trained facilitator is often utilized in the collect requirements process to draw requirements from stakeholders and others with expert judgment. This is true. Usually you have your folks, the business analyst, who they know how to do this. But there are, you know, quite a few PMs, you know, who definitely are good at being able to get people into a room and pull information out of them. Because that's literally what we have to do with folks, right? But we represent it anyways. So we might mind map. That's the affinity diagrams, is when you kind of group them together. Context diagrams. We're going to see an example of a context diagram when we get to, or I'll show you one when we get to risk. All right, we talk about influence diagrams, right? So all of it is just really to, you know, for visual understanding. Right. Then there's decision making. Here goes the nominal. I had you write that word earlier, right? The word nominal. Oh, I got to make this go away. So I got to exit and then restart. Okay. All right. And so we see that word nominal again. And I had you write earlier. All right, but this is either voting or, you know, somebody doing it, you know, by themselves, what we see there. Or there goes that fancy term, multi-criteria decision analysis. Data gathering, brainstorming is pretty straightforward. We might interview people, use focus groups. Remember, it's a group of subject matter experts with the same domain knowledge. Okay. Might use questionnaires and surveys. Benchmarking. Let me talk about this from PMI. They like to try to trip you up and make you think that benchmarking is estimating. So an example of benchmarking would say, I have a project I've been talking about cars. I have a project to build a new car, and it's going to be a sports car. Excuse me. And so our car should go 0 to 60 in 4 seconds or less. That's a benchmark, because that's like a standard for cars, right? So that's what benchmarking is. We have not estimated. So be clear about this when you're taking the exam and you see questions. If it does not ask you about estimating, then we're talking about benchmarking. Like comparing similar products, practices, or processes. Sort of a goal, if you will. And you got document analysis. Double check, measure twice, cut once. Right? So go back and look at all these things. Your plans, your agreements, the contracts you have. You may have some contracts that have language in them that's not favorable to your project. You go look at all these things and see what regulatory laws and codes and ordinances exist that you have to look out for. And then you may prototype. It's another way to get requirements from people is to go build a small portion of it and give it to them and let them touch it, feel it, experience it, and tell you what they like about it. It's one of the best ways. And then we can represent that data. So we talked about mind mapping and then going back to an affinity diagram. The context diagram is where you visually show these things. We have the decision-making techniques. So I had you write down the word nominal here, all right? And then voting, different types, right? The majority, everybody, or, just the largest block.
So CJ, This is Mike Sam. So this is only for the test purposes. I'm just going to ask. So in the PMBOK, it doesn't have nominal group technique listed under decision making. It has it as an interpersonal team skill. So I'm just for test purposes only. How should one approach this? Because basically on the for the PMBOK, it only has voting and multi-criteria analysis.
Yeah, so because you were version 5, so the good news is that now, when you said you failed, was it version 6 or version 5?
I failed both of them, but I can tell you even in PMBOK 6, it has it listed as interpersonal team skill. It doesn't have it listed under decision making. Oh,
I see what you're saying. I'll have to look that up. I don't know 100% for this particular process if in decision making, but I will say for the exam, the good news is that the exam in version 6 is not going to get this deep. You need to know these still, like in version 5, these tools and techniques, you needed to memorize them. Now you don't, you just need to memorize that decision making is a tool and a technique, but you still need to know these terms because they're going to be used in the exam. You just don't have to worry about picking it as an answer. So does that help?
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you, I remember questions where I actually had to pick, a tool or technique. I don't remember exactly nominal group technique. I do remember a question that involved data gathering, and then they asked, what is the best way to do this? And facilitation, I remember facilitation was one of my choices. But good job, good group. This is one of the areas that one of the tasks that I failed on the my last exam. So I think you did a good job. But I just was wondering because I've seen the different uses of nominal group technique.
Yeah, and PMI still, they've switched up a few things from 5 to 6, but yeah, I think I for the most part I don't think this will impact the way the questions are presented in version 6. Okay, so the nominal group technique, now that we've been talking about it, is sort of an advanced brainstorming or voting process, and the idea is that you pose a question to the group, everybody will write down what they think, right? And then the moderator will take all of those, right? They'll give their cards or their stickies, and either they'll write down what's on the card or post the cards or post the stickies all in the area. And then they'll talk about sort of each idea, because we'll group them, because people will have sort of the same ideas. And so, they'll group them together, we'll record them, we'll discuss them to everybody have a clear understanding, and then we'll vote, right? And they say 1 to 5, we call it like fist to 5, how do you feel about it, or, something like that, or they just 1 to 5, and then you'll total them up, and the highest scoring one is picked, right? And so you might have multiple rounds where you just keep going and then you drop off the low one. Or if you have a high one, you pick the top percentage and you keep picking the top. So either you weed out the bottom or you let the cream rise to the top. So those are sort of the ways that you'll do this.